In the book of Exodus, God appears to the biblical patriarch Moses in the form of a burning bush and tells him he is to lead the Israelites, enslaved by the Egyptians, to freedom. In the Bhagavad Gita, the source of all things, Lord Krishna, appears to Prince Arjuna as his charioteer and helps him understand his identity and potential on the eve of a major battle. These appearances by gods, however, are not reserved just for the spiritual heroes of old. Millions of people around the world report having similar religious experiences where they encounter God in a variety of ways, are gifted with spiritual powers, or their souls are washed clean and they are made new again. What exactly is a religious experience? Under what circumstances do they occur? And what should their meaning be in our life? Can we even speak of them in any sort of meaningful way? Join us for this first in a two-part series on religious experience.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Open Door Philosophy. I'm the spiritually enlightened Taylor Jones.
And I'm Andrew, the resident skeptic clairvoyant.
And I'm the traveling faith healer, Derek Parsons. And welcome to episode 81, the first of a two-part series on religious experience. Really looking forward to this one. But first, guys, how's it going? Andrew, let's start with you. You have a dramatic story.
Oh, that's fun. So I was visiting this past weekend. I was going to visit a PhD program, and it was a great trip. I really enjoyed it. I liked the faculty and everything. But the last day I got food poisoning, which was, it was the worst. So it was a very uncomfortable past weekend. And I had food poisoning when I was a kid, but I do not wish it on anybody. It was just, couldn't keep anything down. But other than that, it was great.
And you were on the road when this happened?
I was on the road, yeah.
Ugh, so you're not even at home.
Yeah. So that was not fun, but things could be worse, I guess. And
of course.
Yeah, it was kind of like a mystical day or day and a half. I was just having these fever dreams, not sure what was real. It was maybe a religious experience.
Maybe we'll find out. We'll apply it to the rubric, whatever it is. All right, Taylor, what's going on with you?
Not a whole lot. Well, I don't know, just like into semester stuff. I just had my birthday.
Yes, happy birthday.
Happy birthday.
Yes, thank you. I'm going home next weekend to celebrate with my family. Yeah, good stuff. School's about to get really busy. I literally say that every time. But I feel like every time it just gets busier somehow. But I'm about to be writing like I'm running out of time, a la Alexander Hamilton, because I have so many essays. But other than that, good.
Very good. How many weeks left in the semester? You got to be about like 4 weeks or so.
Yeah, something like that. 3, 4.
Mm-hmm.
We end first week of May. Like May 2nd.
Excellent.
2nd or 3rd.
Soon.
Good.
Upcoming.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's great.
Yep.
That's great. Well,
Yeah.
I don't know.
What about you, Mr. Parsons?
Oh, well, I don't know of anything exciting to report, honestly, in my life. It's beautiful outside in Houston right now, which means it's, not sometime between May and October.
Yeah.
Every afternoon I'm out back in the backyard after work and sitting in a lovely backyard reading a book and just enjoying the weather. Yeah, and our garden's coming alive, and that's always fun. But, like you guys, also nearing the end of the academic cycle. So we'll see what that holds this year. It's going to be a little different for me as in previous years with my new position. So,
yeah.
But anyway, enough of that. Yeah. All right. Well, let's see.
Let me say one more thing too.
Please.
I think we need to finally do a Hegel series.
Oh God, you're bringing us up now.
I'm bringing it up now because I think that we need to do it, and I think with this philosophy of religion or religious experience, we gotta just delve in deep with the scary Hegel man.
Okay. Well, we all know who's going to be in charge of those particular episodes.
Well, the only reason I'm saying it is because, I think this is a good time to encourage people to look up a picture of Hegel, and he's about as inviting as he looks. Yeah.
Have you read Hegel?
Yeah.
Like actual Hegel?
Yeah.
Primary source Hegel?
Primary source Hegel. And
good for you.
Yeah.
He looks really mean.
Yeah. And his writing is mean too. But he's very interesting.
He looks like he would like hit you with his cane or something.
And that's what he does. That's what he does with his philosophy too, in his writing. It's the worst.
Looks like he doesn't like children.
I believe he is known as like notoriously the most difficult philosopher to read. I don't know if that's true.
Probably the German. I mean, Germans are never fun.
Yeah.
Both in terms of the language and in personality.
Apologies to all of our German listeners. Yeah, well, let's do it, man. Let's do some Hegel.
Yeah.
I'm up for it. Maybe. Yeah. Cool. Hey, how's that newsletter going, Andrew?
It's good. We just released I believe it was our third newsletter by Taylor, which is great. And so if you subscribe to it this month, you'll get an introduction newsletter and Taylor's newsletter coming up. And so go to our episode description in YouTube or wherever you're listening, and you can click on a link that will subscribe you, and you'll get a nice welcome message. So encourage everybody to do that.
Yeah, and also, while you're at it, give us a review, follow our content, whether it's on podcast or YouTube or wherever you find our content. We'd love for you to keep up with us in that way, and it helps us with algorithms and all that good stuff. So yeah, go out there and do that, and why not check out our previous episode where we had a guest on, first time in quite some time, Jack Symes. Great conversation about his new book about God, which is a nice segue for this week's episode. Let's do it. Okay, everyone, this week we are going to begin a new series, a two-part series on religious experience, which is kind of an interesting thing to think about, or maybe if you're not familiar with the term, you might not even know exactly what that is. It falls under the branch of philosophy that is philosophy of religion, but it has lots of, like most things in philosophy, lots of ties with other areas of philosophy, metaphysics, obviously, epistemology, certainly language and meaning, anything related to that. Yeah, maybe even philosophy of science. I don't know. But anyway, the thing we're going to do in this episode largely is define what the field is, right? What exactly religious experience is. And then the next episode, we're going to dive into things like language and meaning, verifiability, religious experience as proof of God, justifications for belief, and things like questions of authority. In other words, if someone has a mystical experience or a religious experience, do they now have some authority to speak on things that maybe other people don't? Yeah, that's what the next couple episodes are going to be. So I guess the first thing for us to do, any comments before we hit this first one? Well,
I was thinking a natural question our listeners might have is why are we talking about this in a philosophy podcast?
Mm-hmm. Is that a question for me?
That's a question for both of you guys.
Yeah. Well, I mean, for me, as a person who has grappled with religion all my life, it's something that's very much so outside of something like studying scripture or, the more cerebral part of religion. It's the emotional part of it, I think, or it has something to do with emotions and getting maybe, I don't know, swept up into something, and it's experiencing something entirely different from the type of thing you might experience in religion, which is just like studying the scripture, going to church, doing the things, and it's also very, for lack of a better term, non-scientific, which interests me. But I mean, that being said, it's something that clearly falls under the umbrella of philosophy of religion, and philosophers have written on it extensively. So I don't know. What about you, Taylor?
I mean, same as you. I think it's really interesting to see how religion fits into philosophical systems. and how like that would work within this study of philosophy, because I'm also religious and I've grappled with religion and making sense of that in the world throughout my life too. And also a lot of philosophers grapple with the role of God or the role of religion in their works, whether they're outright like religious philosophers or philosophers of religion. But I think I really like seeing how that fits in, and then how religion is portrayed in different philosophies. Like in the Bhagavad Gita, I think that's a really interesting portrayal of religious experience.
Yeah, the Bhagavad Gita, that's part of a much larger epic, the Mahabharata, which is a part, well, not a part, it's an epic that is strictly from what is considered mystical experience. Whereas other part of Hindu scripture is not considered, revealed through mystical experiences, but the Mahabharata is, which the Bhagavad Gita is part of.
Let me just add something here. I think that this is important for us to think about as philosophical thinkers, because one thing is that it's an experience that a lot of people, if we're talking about religious experience, claim to or believe in. Many religions are grounded in a concept of miracles, and since many take that as their worldview and basing their entire moral systems and things of this sort on these ideas, it's important for us to think about these things philosophically. So I think that that's at least one important reason for us to look at that, aside from just interesting questions that arise from questions about how can we know these religious experiences are true, and what might cause these. Do these show proofs for the existence of God? There's all a sort of interesting number of questions that are wrapped within a topic of religious experience as well.
Yeah, and I think it also is just kind of a fundamental question of philosophy in and of itself. This is kind of a dichotomy between, if we're talking about proofs of God, a dichotomy between rational explanations and experiential explanations, right? So when we think, if you go back to maybe some of our older episodes on philosophy of religion where we're talking about proofs of God, they're all very logical. And this type of proof, you've had a religious experience of some kind, that is entirely different than a logical proof. It's kind of that classic difference in philosophy, rational versus experience.
Definitely.
Yeah.
So I guess the thing we should do first, and so just for background for everyone, I teach this in my course. I teach an entire unit on philosophy of religion. Within that unit, of course, is religious experience. And I've read a lot about it. And there is really no one definition, I suppose, that everyone agrees on. They all kind of harmonize with each other in one way or another. But there's no real one definition of what religious experience is. So I thought we would talk about that for a moment to get us going here, kind of getting the scope of the field. So religious experience, what do you guys think it is? How do we know it? What is it?
I think that there's probably two types that I can immediately think of. There's an individual religious experience, and then there's religious experiences that exist between more than two people. The first one, it seems to me, this is like a feeling, or, a person goes through an internal revelation or something of this kind. The second, where it's crossed between two people, this would seem something to me more miraculous, maybe. So I don't know. It seems like there's a natural divide between kind of a internal, where it's just inside of one person and affecting, the physical world. But I think they would all kind of boil down to some, I don't know. I can't put a border around it any more than that, I think.
I think that makes sense that Andrew's kind of pointed out the separation of things that happen just within the self, like solely an individual experience versus things that you might experience with other people. And like a miracle, if you think like a healing, you see examples of that in the Bible where there's a group of people and Jesus performs a miracle or like feeds a bunch of people, which I would think is a religious experience. But I think too, it is kind of hard to define. Like, how do you pinpoint exactly what it is?
Yeah. So I have sometimes, well, I mean, I never hard define it for my students, but sometimes I suggest that there's something different between a miracle and these other things that we call religious experiences. But Andrew makes this division, right? That we have individual events and we have communal events, right? That at least involve more than one person. And, religious experiences such as a vision from God or a mystical experience or a charismatic experience where you receive a gift of the Spirit or something like that are all individual. They're internal. No one else is experiencing that, right? Versus a miracle, which is, again, involves two or more people. And if you're witnessing the miracle, is that a religious experience for you? Or is that like, I don't know, a religious event or something? Maybe we're playing too much with semantics, but it seems like for a miracle, there's really only two people involved, unless a whole bunch of people are getting healed at once or something.
Yeah.
I suppose. And so, you may have been involved in a service of some type or a religious occasion where other people maybe perhaps are experiencing a religious experience, but you're not. And so that's sometimes why I at least suggest the idea of differentiating between miracles, like is in its own category, versus religious experience. But they both have the same problem. And I don't know if problem is the right word, but verifiability is a part of all of that.
I'm not sure if miracles are totally. If I was thinking about this, I would be thinking about the most broad category as a religious experience, and then the miracle would be a subcategory of a religious experience. Another subcategory might be, I don't know, a feeling, or I forget the exact words that you said. A religious feeling or a mystical experience is another subcategory. I was thinking of two as you were saying. There's a famous apparition in 1913 where there's these three children in Portugal who all claim to say that they saw the Blessed Mother, Mary, come to visit them all. And so that's a shared religious experience between three people who all say the same thing. There's another instance in, I believe it was like 6 months later, where between 30,000 and 100,000 people in 1913 or 1914 experience a religious experience together where they claim to see the sun dancing around the sky. And we can also think about in Islam where it's not in the Quran, but in some of the reports that his followers put together that Muhammad split the moon. And so are these all miracles? Are they all religious experiences? Probably. I think there's overlap of both in them. There's not necessarily healing, but it seems like it's an experience. It's miraculous, but it's both, I don't know.
Yeah, I have no qualms with throwing group religious experiences under that category. I'm just pointing out that something different. A lot of what people will say when you read literature about religious experiences, one of the big problems is that it's entirely individual.
Oh,
and
I
that
see.
You can't, beetle in the box sort of situation. You can't penetrate that. You can only rely on report, right? God spoke to me. Let's say, Moses goes up on the mountain and receives the Ten Commandments and comes back down. No one was there to see it.
Yeah.
So that's just a difference. I don't think it's a significant difference, but that's one of the problems of religious experiences. It's individual nature. But yeah, there's plenty of reports of like groups, as you mentioned, Andrew, experiencing religious events, experiences.
Let me bring something up, pointing out something as we might be going into this. I think that even in a Christianity divide between, you have your Eastern Orthodoxes and your Catholics and your Protestants, but also just going outside with, Muslims and different religious groups have different beliefs about the truth about religious experiences. I think Catholics tend to be much more, I can't speak for all Catholics, but I think the Catholic Church tends to be much more skeptical, a Baptist or, Assembly of God Church, about individual religious experiences. And I think that, we have this line in the Quran, the people, I think they're the polytheists, are chastising Muhammad, perform a miracle. And he tells them, well, I'm not going to perform a miracle, because if you look around you right now, the whole world is a miracle from it, that the fact that
Yeah.
it all works together. I just want to point that out as a starting place.
Mm-hmm.
I think Andrew's point about different denominations of the Christian church interacting with religious experiences is really interesting. Because I grew up in a non-denominational church, and the church I go to now is non-denominational, and they're very encouraging of you to individually encounter the Lord, having that individual experience, and that's really important, which I hadn't really thought much about the Catholic Church being more skeptical to that. So I think that's really interesting that even within one religious belief that different groups interact differently.
Oh yeah. And even within Christianity, right? So we have these numerous branches, and yes, some are more prone to being open to the idea of not mystical experiences necessarily, but religious experiences, and others aren't. And what's interesting, at least from a Christianity standpoint, it's very rational. Christianity is very rational. It's very Western. When we talk about these religious experiences, all of this is baked within. Well, it all started with Greece, right? Human rationalism, and it's been outlined by that. You go to the East, and whether we're talking about Hinduism or Shinto or something like that, the idea of a religious experience is probably very different than ours, because their worldview is less rational. There's plenty of rationality in it. But the idea of the world being alive, the world being something that is mysterious versus, a sort of Western scientific view of the world, I just don't know that it's that big of a deal in the East. I mean, I think it's a big deal, but I don't know, just that particular worldview, I think is a big difference. And we see, again, that different type of worldview in what you guys have already talked about. Catholicism being a little more skeptical. Catholicism does come from the scholastic background, whereas evangelicalism or Assembly of God or charismatic churches, come from an entirely different tradition, or rather entirely different worldview. And I was thinking it might be curious to see what each of us, our experiences are, just our background, because although all three of us come from a Christian background, I come from, well, I don't even know what you call it. Well, Restorationism, technically, but it's Church of Christ. It's what I grew up in. Andrew's obviously Catholic, and Taylor non-denominational. So, what is not necessarily our direct experiences with religious experience, but what maybe is from our three particular perspectives, from our traditions, how do those traditions view religious experiences?
Let me start off with a funny story. And it's I don't know, I think it's pretty funny, and illustrates this point pretty well. I had a friend who was an atheist, but they were curious about exploring more about Christianity, and so we kept talking with each other in dialogue to what's the hurdles here. Okay, one thing that they said was, well, if Jesus was exists and is God, okay, of course, but I'm really struggling with this. I was like, okay, well, let me think about this. And then I think that I tried to present some kind of logical claim to this, or a historical, or I don't know, something of this sort. So I go and ask one of my other friends, what do you think about this? It's a good point. This person, I believe, I don't want to slander him, but I believe he comes from a Church of Christ background, but he's converted into more of a, but he's converted more into a traditional church right now. Not so much as a Catholic, but I would still consider more traditional than other things. So I asked him, and he's like, well, Andrew, I've never struggled with this idea much, because for me, Christianity is all about a personal experience with God, or with Jesus. It's like, well, I felt kind of stupid, because I was like, well, yeah, that's kind of the stock answer that you're supposed to give here. But that wasn't my first place to go to. So, I mean, I think that is an interesting divide coming into this. And so I'll let you all talk about this with your experiences first, but I think that's a funny story for people who are not as aware as some of the differences.
How about your tradition,
Well, okay. I think in the South, a lot of non-denominational churches kind of lean Baptist. From my understanding,
Mm-hmm.
that's kind of how it goes. But they just don't conform to all of the like Baptist conventions. But at least like the church I'm going to now, where I'm more involved, is very heavy on the like personal experience with God, and like that it's about a personal relationship with Jesus, and like having those individual, I don't know if I want to say encounters, but like spending time individually, like reading the Bible and praying and like talking to God, and then also doing that in communities, small groups, like a life group, community group, whatever, like your church calls it, like doing that in community and large, like overarching, I don't know, like the whole church. So more on the like, it's about a personal relationship, but you should have like different, doing that in multiple ways. So like individually, but it's also important to do it in community.
So personal relationship with God, what does that mean in terms of like religious experience? Are you experiencing God? Like, are we talking about visions of God, or are we talking about just feelings, or like how does that look?
I think that kind of depends on the person. I know some people have said like, oh, I've gotten this like image from God, or like this vision of like, this is what's going to happen. Or one of my friends talks about like getting dreams of like what her future might be. So I think it just kind of depends. But they encourage like, oh, pray a sign or a word or a vision or something.
So in my tradition, Church of Christ, growing up, the belief was, not that anyone ever talked to me about this, but the belief was miracles were something that happened in the Bible, and those don't happen anymore. Now, maybe a miracle might happen, like you pray for someone to be cured from cancer, and then the next day they do a scan and the cancer's gone. We're like, wow, maybe that kind of miracle, but not a miracle where like someone walks into the hospital, lays hands on the person and heals them. You know, not that type of miracle, if that makes sense. And then like if anyone in my tradition was to say, yes, God spoke to me, they'd be like, what? So there's this notion of like God leading me in a certain direction, or I feel the presence of God, but there's no like God spoke to me type of visions, if that makes sense. So actually, let me give you an example from my past, not my childhood, but at my previous school I was at. I had a student who came to visit me and said that she needed to, drop the advanced classes that she was in. And this is quite common. I'm like, okay, well, let's talk about the reasons and see if, this is something we should do. And she said, well, the reason I'm doing it is because God told me so. I'm like, oh. I'm like, so that's a new one to me. I'm like, oh, okay. What do you mean by God told you to drop these classes? She said, well, I was at church and we were all praying and a vision of God came to me. And God was telling me that I needed to rededicate my life to him so that I can serve him throughout my life. And in order for me to do that, I need to spend more time in his word. And so I need to drop these advanced classes so I can have less homework. And I'm like, God, she's like, God said that to me, right? Not like I have a feeling, I have it. So like a vision of God. Okay. Obviously, I'm not arguing with that. So, and then like a couple days later, her parents came to see me and we were talking about it and they were like, yep, that's what happened. God spoke to her and told her to do this. Okay. I'm not arguing with that. So when I say like, when we're talking about religious experiences and exactly what we mean, there is this notion of like religious feeling. God is leading me in this direction. I feel God's presence in my life versus something we would call like a vision where God appears to you, right? And speaks to you. And there's plenty of accounts of that, by the way. So so with my tradition growing up, none of that type of stuff happened. God would lead you in a way, you pray to God, but like the voice of God, would not pop up in your head or something like that.
Yeah, mine's probably more similar to that. I would say with some differences. I think Catholics on their own are very skeptical of individual signs, and something like Mr. Parsons' event would probably be written off as or not your event, but the event of your student would be probably written off as a intellectual moment where your mind just kind of tricked you. I don't know. I'm just guessing that would be said. That's what it would be. Or possibly it could be a demon who is impressionating
Yes.
God. It would be. I mean, we wouldn't jump to the second, but I suppose that would be a possibility. But in the same sense, I mean, there's mystics who believe that there's apparitions of Mary and of. I think Jesus comes. In fact, today is a celebration in the Catholic Church of a very famous moment where Jesus does come. And I mean, it's not canon. I mean, it's not necessarily. You don't have to believe that it's true, but it's a very famous apparition today called Divine Mercy Sunday, where Jesus came down and told a nun about a mystical experience. So there's certainly that, and of course that at every Mass there's a miracle that's performed where Jesus, the bread and wine is physically or transubstantially transformed into Jesus's body, blood, soul, and divinity. So there's a good mix there, I believe. And I think all of those are somewhat religious experience, but the personal, hearing a vision, a voice, things like that, I think that's probably going to be said. You should probably see someone about that, a priest or a mental health counselor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess so. The point of all this is there's a wide variety of things that are considered religious experiences. In fact, I'm almost just drawn to say naturally, there's a variety of religious experiences. And if you're at all familiar with William James has a book called The Variety of Religious Experiences, which was actually a series of lectures. It was it's a 20-part lecture. Just think about that for a moment. That's what people did for fun back then. But it was a very prestigious lecture series over in Scotland. But now it's a book, and it's called The Variety of Religious Experience. It's kind of the go-to. There's still plenty of wonderful stuff contemporarily being written. It's about 120 years old. No, about 110 years old. But in it is a report of literally what the title says, a variety of religious experiences from all experiences, all religious traditions, even outside of Christianity. So that is an interesting collection of those. So anyway, the point is there's a variety of religious experiences. I mean, I'm glad, Andrew, you brought up demons, because oftentimes when we talk about religious experiences, we think about it in a positive way, like, oh, God came and saw me, or I've been blessed by God, or whatever. But also a part of religious experiences, something like demon possession or exorcism. Exorcism. Yeah, exorcism and something along that lines. So casting out demons. This would also fall under the category of religious experience. So anyway, it's kind of religious experience seems to be that thing that is beyond the veil of normal experience. So let's maybe talk about some categories, because we're just shooting all over the place, which is the point. Yeah. But let's look at some categories of what have been identified as types of religious experiences. The first one of these is what's called regenerative. So a regenerative religious experience is when someone undergoes a life transformation. So we're talking about conversion here, that the person has felt like they have experienced salvation. They've been delivered from evil. Their lives have new meaning, new understanding, new clarity. They're a new person. So this is a regenerative religious experience. If you want to go with a secular example, you can think of Scrooge from A Christmas Carol. He's a terrible person, but then one night has I guess the ghost, I guess we could call that religious experience. He has quite an experience, and he wakes up the next day and he bursts open the windows and he yells out to everyone on the streets, I am a new man. So that's a secular example of it, but that's what regenerative is. And in my tradition that I grew up in, that's totally fine. Yeah, I guess that's the way to say it. That's within the norm. So anyway, that's one category.
Mm-hmm. Can I ask a clarifying question here for you guys? Because this is something that I think for a Catholic, this is not something that's common. So, which is interesting. So would you say that in the moment itself, that person is transformed in that moment? Or would the religious experience itself provide the bridge for someone to begin a religious transformation? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So is it in the moment they're just substantially changed in their faith where they're almost completely different? Or does religious experience itself provide the attitude for someone to be like, oh shoot, like I need to get my life together. I need to, because the second is something that I think the Catholic would say, sure. But the first, I think they would be a little bit more skeptical. So curious. I'm just curious.
Yeah, no, it's a great distinction. I don't know. What do you think, Taylor?
I think it can be either, and that's kind of how my church talks about it. Like you can have a moment of
clarity,
of like or like conviction of like, okay, I've been doing this sin, like living in this way that I'm not supposed to, and that's harmful, and I want to like get closer to God and like start going to church more and like being more involved. And it can be that way of like a moment where it starts a transformation, or it can be like having an experience where it's like maybe you've been struggling with something and you're like, I don't know, at a service, or it could be completely individual, and you have an encounter with God and it's like, oh, I've been completely like healed of this thing. And it can be like instantaneous or like within a short amount of time, and then you walk out and you're like, I'm good.
Okay.
Yeah, my experience, so there's this term born again Christian, which is often associated with New World denominations. But also I'd like to throw Baptist and Methodist in there, although technically those are Old World, but they definitely developed at their peak in the New World. Yeah. And so there's notion that when you're baptized, of course, so this circumvents something like christening and then the confirmation process. When you're baptized, it's called born again. And in my tradition, of course, there was some lead up to that moment where you're going to get baptized, obviously. It's not something that just like snaps you like, yes, I want to get baptized. Like, you're probably thinking about things and all that. But when you're baptized, again, this is Church of Christ. When you're baptized, like you go under the water and you come back out again, your soul is pure. You are born again. Every sin that has come before has been washed clean. So, that's from that particular perspective. And I think most, we call them dunkers. I think most dunker denominations, full submersion, but believe that to be similar. And you can think of like, in earlier traditions, in earlier times in the United States, the traveling preacher would come to town, and then people would be moved, and then we'd all go down to the river because that was the place to go in the 1900s, and everyone would get baptized in the river. And so the question is that symbolic of your soul becoming clean, or is literally your soul clean? But that's the regenerative process, for that particular perspective.
I think even the Catholic would say in that moment where you're baptized, that I don't think we've dunked since like the 1500s, maybe, I'm not sure. But in that moment of baptism, even if, and this is an important part, I think, even if you're whoever does it, you don't even have to be a Catholic priest for the baptism to take place. Your soul is cleansed in that moment from all sin. But the thing that I think the Catholic would say is like, okay, your soul is cleansed from sin. However, the soul still would remain its natural inclinations, its proclivities.
Sure.
And so just because your soul has been cleansed from sin, just like everyone, they have temptations and doubts just by who they are and their, the defects that they carry. And so if you're tempted, say, to alcoholism because of some genetic condition in your DNA, that's not going to go away.
Right.
If you're tempted by, whatever, that's not going to go away, but you're going to have the grace to be able to change that within yourself and to have the opportunity to habitualize that out of you, which is very Aristotelian. And so I think that point of habit, by God's grace, we can fix this, but it's probably going to take some time. It's not going to be an instantaneous kind of thing. Yeah. And that just becomes by part of our human condition, I think. Anyways.
So I think of all the categories we're talking about, this is the one that's probably the least no, I don't want to say emotional or something, because obviously dedicating your life to God and getting baptized is very emotional. But it doesn't involve a lot of outward supernatural type of elements.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
So that's regenerative. The next one I have is what is called charismatic. So this would be experiences of special abilities, gifts, and or blessings. So anyone in the Pentecostal branch would be very familiar with this. The ideas of the gifts of the Spirit. So that's being able to heal or being able to speak in tongues, prophesying, talking about dreams and visions. There's this sort of supernatural infusion of wisdom sometimes, a supernatural infusion of knowledge and of faith. That's very outward. So if anyone's ever attended a Pentecostal church or an Assembly of God or apostolic church, it's quite common for the congregation to begin speaking in tongues at some point in the service. And so this would be considered a charismatic experience. So the gifts of the Spirit, as they are, which I believe comes from Acts, as outlined in Acts.
Yeah.
The gifts of the Spirit is something that,
Yeah.
Can be manifested, or at least can come upon you in a charismatic experience. By the way, in the tradition I grew up in, that's a big no. None of that stuff happens, but certainly in other denominations. And by the way, that is all of this is also outside of Christianity. There are certainly charismatics in every single religion that exists. So I don't ever want to think this is just like a Pentecostal thing or something.
Yeah.
But so that's what charismatic is. I don't know, thoughts?
My church has like some elements of this. I don't know how it compares to the Pentecostals, but like prayer for healing. Oh, like this person has, like their leg is broken. Like, let's pray for healing. Or like they sprained their ankle. Let's pray for healing and that they're able to walk. And then prophesying or like dreams and visions. Yes. Speaking in tongues, I don't know. To some degree, my church is like, yeah, like we see it in the Bible. Like we believe that this can happen.
When I say healing with charismatic, like it's not what you're describing.
It's instantaneous.
It's like, the person with the broken leg is like right there, and you put your hands on them, pray for them, and their leg is healed.
Yeah. I think that the Catholic take on tongues is like the tongues that they were talking about in Acts is the ability to speak foreign languages, to speak different tongues, not to go to some, demonic, we'd probably call demonic or fake language of whatever. Miracles, instantaneous miracles can, and I think they do happen, but that's it's a supernatural occurrence. It's not and it's a kind of purposeful moment from God to for something. There's a whole bunch of philosophical books. I actually met a guy the other day who I think his whole purpose in his scholarly career is to try to define why God would have healing miracles. Yeah. There is actually charismatic Catholics. There's a very famous group in Houston, actually. Yeah.
That's interesting. One of the questions with charismatic, or really a lot of religious experiences, what exactly is an authentic one? And I guess like maybe why should we care if someone wants to believe they've had an authentic charismatic experience? What does it matter to us if they're really speaking in tongues or if they're not? And they think they are. But it's a good question, right? Like what constitutes an authentic charismatic experience? Because you do get into some other things that are more evident, right? As opposed to say like regenerative. So if we're talking about healing, I mean, that's right there in front of us. And speaking in tongues, is something that we can all hear. And, and prophesying can be very important. So how do we authenticate these types of experiences? I don't know the answer to that, but I mean, this is one of the issues that comes with religious experiences, especially like an issue of authority. If someone's prophesying, so what establishes their authority? Why should we listen to this person as opposed to someone else? So it's an issue of authentication.
My church and like the life group that I'm in talk about it as like, okay, if you think you've gotten this word or like had this experience from God, write it down and like pray about it and ask like, was this actually from God? And check it with scripture of like, does whatever I think God has said to me align with what it says in the Bible and like that sort of thing, like checking it and making sure this isn't you have like had this idea or not, or that you're being misled, and having some sort of verifiability. But then again, like, how do you completely check? Like, you can't necessarily say, okay, I've gone through all these steps, I can be 100% sure rationally that it checks out, it's from God, that God has said this.
So that's an interesting division from my own, where it's not the individual who's going to be verifying this. In fact, the individual is going to be severely distrusted to the point where it will take years and years to verify a religious experience, and the individual is probably going to be thought to be either assumed to be lying, or to assumed to be probably lying. A religious miracle will be tested to the fullest extent, and this would not be like a vision or something. If it's a vision, I think it would be under higher scrutiny, where your entire life would be looked at. But if it's a miracle healing, I think they would go see, they would go to different atheist doctors, see if there's another way that this could be proven. I mean, they're taken extremely seriously in this extent of it's not up to the individual at all, which is it's very, very Catholic. Yeah.
Yeah, I was reading actually the other day, because I know when saints are canonized, they have to prove that they have had at least 2 miracles attributed to them. And so I was reading about the process, actually, because I was like, okay, well, how do we do that?
Yeah.
And yeah, it takes years, and they do investigate the person's entire life. Are they a person of virtue? They interview people. Yeah, it's a whole thing, which is kind of interesting. Here's one I think that a lot of people are immediately skeptical of when we talk about this type of charismatic revelation, which is end of times. The God is bringing it all to an end on August 23rd, 2024. So get in line, folks. Get your life straight. This has happened many times. In fact, in the 1800s in the United States, it was quite common for there to be these end of times. Eschatological is the fancy word for. That's
the whole Jehovah's Witness thing.
Yeah, and so I think a lot of people of that particular type of charismatic responses, they're pretty skeptical of that. And so, so how do you divide from that type of authority, versus some other type of prophecy? The third category I have is what's called mystical. And this is a rather broad category. William James discusses it at length in his lecture, and I think it's so broad because it's very difficult to define. If you thought the other ones were difficult to define, this one's even worse. So a mystical experience, and by the way, every religion has mystical branches of that religion, and people within, even if there's not an official branch, people within those religions report to have mystical experiences. So mystical experiences most commonly is just simply described as a type of union or unity with God.
Yep.
So in the West, we're talking about something like, and I have a couple of examples here, but becoming one with God. In the East, we're going to talk about something like becoming a part of ultimate reality or absolute reality. So in Hinduism, that's going to be becoming one with Brahman or Nirvana. And in the East, you become one with the Tao. So this division, this dichotomy between human and God disappears, and there is a unity between those two. So that is a mystical experience. Other types of mystical experiences also, this is very noetic, as it's called, as if maybe you are on a mountaintop or looking at the ocean or something, and you have this feeling that you are tiny, and that there's something just so much greater than you, but you can't quite put words to it. That would also, some people would say that's a mystical experience, but I really kind of want to focus on the idea of unity, right?
Yeah, I wasn't going to add anything. I think you have 3 really interesting quotes here, and so I think we should share them and talk about them. Yeah.
Yeah, let me do it. So one of the qualities of a mystical experience is its just ineffability. It's lack of ability to describe it in human words, right?
Yep.
So here's one example from Hinduism around the 8th century. When the mind is completely absorbed in the supreme being, the Atman, Brahman, the Absolute, then the world of appearances vanish. Its existence is no more than an empty word. There is neither seer, nor seeing, nor seen. There is but one reality, changeless, formless, and absolute. The universe no longer exists after we have awakened into the higher consciousness of eternal Atman, which is Brahman, devoid of any distinction or division. Even though his mind is dissolved in Brahman, he is fully awake, free from the ignorance of waking life. He is fully conscious, but free from any craving. So that's a Hindu example. Here's two from a Christian perspective. Meister Eckhart, a 13th century, 14th century mystic. If I am to know God directly, I must become completely he and he I, so that he and this I become and are one. And then St. John of the Cross, 16th century, having been made one with God, the soul is somehow God through participation. Although it is not God as perfectly as it will be in the next life, it is like the shadow of God. Being the shadow of God through this substantial transformation, it performs in this measure in God and through God what he, through himself, does in it. For the will of the two is one will, and thus God's operation and the soul is one. So, union with God. The division disappears, and there is unity. It's quite prevalent, by the way. Like these, I've given some old examples. There are mystics amongst us today, without question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, let me say for the last example with St. John of the Cross, he's a very famous Spanish poet as well. He has a very famous poem called The Dark Night of the Soul, which is beautiful, very short. But I believe for him and a lot of Catholic mystics, the idea is that the will conforms to the will of God in this world. And so our souls, through that participation, are cleansed and changed as much as they can be, so that we achieve some kind of closeness with God in this life, and then in the next life in heaven. Nobody really knows what happens, but I think that a mystic like St. John of the Cross would say something like, yeah, it's going to be unity with God. We're all going to become members of the physical, the body of Christ. So that unity in the next life will be achieved in a way that in this life is not. And so, yeah, I think that makes sense. Who am I to argue with St. John of the Cross? But I think that it's not about unity. Perfect unity will never be achieved in this life, I think. And I think he would be the first to say that. But the will, in doing God's will and our will, they can be unified in this world. And so that's a very close participation with God. Well, let me say something else too. Now that you're saying this, have any of you read Dante's Paradiso?
Yes.
Oh, not Paradiso.
So what is that?
What is that?
Do you remember what the image of heaven is, Parsons, and
It's like
Paradiso?
Oh boy, it's been a long time. The thing that's in my head is the famous drawing of Beatrice and Dante looking into the heavens, which is just this swirl of angels and light. And another thing I recall from reading Paradiso is just how abstract it all was, at least to me, in attempting to describe heaven and God. In my mind, I'm just thinking of light, brightness, a lot of that. I don't know. Remind me.
I believe, and I could be getting this wrong because it's been a while, but I believe the image is that the pathway of heaven is like a rose. And so the rose being, if we can imagine like the petals of a rose, it's all connected.
Mm-hmm.
As you get closer and closer to the center, the petals get closer and tighter together.
Mm-hmm.
And so, the believers in Dante who believe in God, but fail in some way or something like this. They're going to be they're going to be further away from God, although still connected. And as we get closer and closer to doing the will of God. We're closer and closer to the center, closer and closer to perfection. And so I think that's an interesting image where there's unity, but there's also a kind of closeness and furtherness away from God as well.
Yeah, and just like his other two books, Inferno and Purgatorio, there is this conception of levels, right? Or circles, as they call them. Right. And so, the further down you go, the circles in hell, the more tight the gyre, I think is what he calls it. It winds till finally, you get out of there, and you're now in purgatory, and you're climbing Mount Purgatory. Again, you can think of a mountain, a peak. So as you continue to go up that peak, it's going to get more restricted. So we're spiraling up instead of spiraling down. Yeah, it's a beautiful way to describe all of that. Yeah, some interesting things about mystical experiences or any religious experience. One of the big questions is like, is it something you're in control of? I really want to experience God. I want to have this union with God. Try real hard. Is it something you can do, or is it something that comes upon you? And of course, we also, this is why William James, who was also a psychologist, identified as the father of American psychology, he was very interested in brain states. And so if you're having a mystical experience, what does that mean in your physical brain? And so one of the questions is, can you bring on mystical experiences? Now, we know that there are all kinds of mind-altering drugs that people can take, and those alter your brain states. And people do report when they take those types of drugs, LSD and other hallucinogens, that the barrier between you and the world just kind of dissolves, and you become, you're part of it. There's not this third person sort of view. But also it's been reported that people who meditate heavily for like hours, who have been practicing it for years, they have similar brain states as people who are on hallucinogens. And that many people who meditate, this is certainly a very Eastern thing, but it can be done through prayer as well. That can be a type of meditation, that those brain states are similar to that. And this is when people do report mystical experiences, right? When they do something like meditation for a very long time. But yeah, that's interesting. One of the questions is, can you bring about can you trigger, start a religious experience, or is it something that, comes upon you?
I think it's interesting. You mentioned, the meditation and is maybe a way to bring upon God, because I'm thinking of three right now from three different religions where we see something like this happen. The first is, the Buddha, where he goes and meditates under the tree. And that kind of triggers a type of religious awakening or religious experience or experience with the universe. And then I'm thinking of in the Quran. I can't remember if it's in the Quran or if it's a story about Muhammad, which it's probably the latter. But Muhammad goes into a cave. And experiences the visions or an experience with the angel Gabriel, where he's prompted to read the Quran, and he says, "Well, I can't read," and the angel Gabriel chokes him with his scarf or something until he reads. And then I'm thinking of Saint Benedict, a Catholic mystic in his own right, who founds a very famous order of monks who goes into a cave and refuses to leave until he sees the face of God. And so it's something interesting about the retreating from the world in three religious cases, retreating from the world and kind of not leaving until you have a religious experience, which I think is an interesting overlap.
And then in the Bible too, it says, it's somewhere in the New Testament, I can't remember where, but where it's go into the secret place. Don't be in the streets like trying to have this public religious experience for show, but like go into the secret place where you're alone with God and having this individual experience versus something
point. Public. And Jesus goes into the desert himself.
That's right. He goes into the desert, and then the day of, not transubstantiation. What is it? When he sees Elijah and
Transfiguration.
Transfiguration, yeah, the moment of transfiguration, I believe, was also on a hilltop, a mountain.
Yeah, they go to a mountain.
Somewhat secluded. Yeah, they're somewhat secluded. Yeah, and many of the stories I'm familiar with of medieval monks, hermits, they live a very ascetic life, right? They sort of, eschew all possessions, and they live as simple a life as possible. And I mean, to be honest, caves is not an unfamiliar notion in the Middle Ages for the medieval period for monks to have these types of experiences. They remove themselves, right? Yeah. And so physiologically, of course, this would have an impact on brain states, right? Because especially if you're fasting, something like that, the body is biological. You can't avoid that. We're not going to get into the philosophical topic of consciousness, but it does seem that the mind is associated or connected with the brain in some way, if it is not, in fact, the brain itself. So clearly there's going to be physiological aspects here that can influence this, I think.
Definitely.
I don't know what else to say about that.
No, I think you hit it. Should we quickly talk about Hume and Swinburne's kind of definitions of miracles quickly?
Yeah, let's talk about that. Yeah, the last one is miracles, which we've talked about kind of at the beginning of the episode. Miracles are interesting. I mean, I guess they're all interesting in their own way. David Hume, says that a miracle, by definition, is a violation of the laws of nature. And if you think about the miracles of, say, like Christ, where he's bringing people back from the dead. Well, he only did it once. Or if he's healing people of blindness. What, are you counting himself? Yeah. Was there twice?
I believe he raises two separate Lazaruses. There's two separate ones, but maybe that's scholarly dispute.
Okay, well, I'm no biblical scholar. So you think about Jesus's miracles. We're healing physiological things: blindness, leprosy, death. These are a violation of the laws of nature, according to Hume. And so he says these violations of these laws just simply contradict how we understand how the universe operates. And so he was highly skeptical. I'm not sure he believed in miracles at all. But anyway, anything to say about that, Andrew? I had a lot written there, but
I think the concept of testimony is interesting too. Testifying to their miracles. I've heard this phrase recently, but I know that testimony is very important to a lot of Christians. You have to give your testimony and your account of things. And I think the reason that Catholics are why I've never heard this term before is similar to why Hume might be skeptical about these, because of the possible flaws of human beings with all their faults.
Prone to excitement, exaggeration, and misunderstanding is what I had written down there. And we are. I mean, humans.
Absolutely.
Humans, yeah. Then Hume kind of takes a probability perspective on it, right? So we're like supposed to weigh human testimony against the probability of these events occurring. And he's just like, a miracle is basically, a miracle is just highly improbable, whereas the universe following the laws of nature is highly probable. And so when you weigh these two against each other, again, he doesn't totally rule it out. Probability is incredibly low for Hume. But clearly people believe in miracles, and many philosophers of religion do. So Richard Swinburne is one of those. And we'll probably talk, we talk about Swinburne probably a lot anytime we talk about philosophy of religion. But his principle of credelity, we will get into this more next episode, but it was kind of a response to Hume, so I want to bring it up briefly here. This principle of credelity is simply stated, and this is quote, a principle of rationality that in the absence of special considerations, if it seems epistemically to a subject that X is present, then probably X is present. What one seems to perceive is probably so. So we'll get into this more, but that's his very brief response to that. If someone thinks that a miracle happened, then they think that in the absence of special considerations, then if they think it happened, it probably happened. That's his response. I think we'll be critical of these two arguments in the next episode.
Yeah, definitely. I think that we were just kind of setting the groundwork in this episode, so don't expect some much philosophical counter argument here. But there certainly is a lot for philosophy of religious experiences. So, and I included this one book for people who are interested and who might be skeptical of these things, like I am. There's a book who's written by it's an atheist physician. She also does a lot on the history of medicine, although she's just a physician and she works in a lab. She had an experience where she was brought 2 samples of DNA, and she was asked to compare them. And she said, these are absolutely similar. They're the exact same thing. And she was basically checking a reading from someone else, and she said, "Well, they're the exact same thing. And if a lab told you that they were different, then that would be grounds. If they were collected like from a different strand of hair or whatever, and they were the same, then that lab could be sued, basically." And then it was revealed to her that these were samples from 2 different Eucharistic hosts that had been transformed into skin or blood, I can't remember, from 2 different parts of the world. And so that sent her on a scholarly research report, basically. And so this is a very thick book. I have it on ILL, so it'll come next time in the next year, probably. So this is Dr. Jacqueline Duffin's Medical Miracles, Doctors, Saints, and Healing in the Modern World. And it's a scholarly book, but just in case you're interested, she's looking at a number of these miracles.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. And I guess as long as we're recommending books on this topic, Varieties of Religious Experience by William James, also very dense, very accessible, but it is long. Okay, guys. Well, hey, that's it. You're thinking to yourself, man, it's a miracle that this episode's finally over. It was going on so long. But anyway, thank you for listening, everybody. We certainly appreciate that you do.
All right. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram, on YouTube. Hit the subscribe button. You can click post notifications so you never miss a video on YouTube or Spotify or wherever else you get your podcasts. If you do want to see our beautiful faces, go over to YouTube where there's the videos that Andrew works hard to get up. And yeah, if you have any questions, comments, future episode topics, things that you want us to talk about, let us know over at our Instagram at Open Door Philosophy or on our email at contact@opendoorphilosophy.com.
Oh, that's great. And subscribe to the newsletter in our description so you can hear more, I guess, read more from us. I guess it's not seeing more of us. Anyways, that was a lot of fun, guys. Make sure to tune in next time as we finish this religious experience series. And remember, when your life is in need of some philosophy, the door is always open. Bye.
Bye.
Have a miraculous week. Epistemically. God, if it seems epistemically. If it seems epistemically. My Lord. Thank you, Andrew. If it seems if it seems epistemically. Epistemically. If it seems epistemically to a subject that X is present, then probably X is present.